afternoon. Thank you so much for coming here today. My name is Brian Judge, and I am the program director of the program on finance and democracy here at BESI in the social science matrix. It is my distinct pleasure to get to introduce Fabian Muniesa. So before doing that, just want to thank the BESI Finance and Democracy and BESI Tech as co-sponsors of this wonderful event, and thank Sarah, Aaron, Jana, and everyone else who helped make this a possibility. And if you're not already signed up for the BESI newsletter, highly encourage you to go to besi.berkeley.edu, sign up, and learn more about the program on finance and democracy and BESI Tech. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Fabian Muniesa. He's a professor at the École des Mines in Paris and a member of the Center of Sociology of Innovation. I even put out the French phonetic pronunciation, but I won't even attempt it in front of the crowd. So trained as a sociologist in Madrid, he completed his PhD with a thesis on automated trading at the Paris Stock Exchange, written at a time when few social scientists were paying attention to how algorithms were reshaping financial markets. After a postdoc at the London School of Economics, he returned to Paris, where he has been based ever since. A founding contributor to the social studies of finance, his work focuses on the anthropological critique of the culture of capitalism and on the troubles of economic meaning. Over the years, he has addressed topics ranging from the sociology of algorithms and the epistemology of economics to the psychology of business education, the politics of responsible innovation, and the anthropology of financial valuation. His work has been featured in journals such as the Journal of Cultural Economy and Economy and Society, and he's a co-founder and board member of Valuation Studies. From 2011 to 2015, he held a European Research Council grant, and for a decade he served as the executive director of the Observatory for Responsible Innovation. So his works include the provoked economy, which developed an approach to economic performativity inspired by the philosophy of Deleuze and Latour, Assetization, co-edited with Key and Birch for the MIT Press, and Do Economists Make Markets, co-edited with Donald Mackenzie and Lucia Su. So today he joins us to discuss ideas from his most recent book, Paranoid Finance, published by Polity in 2024. In it, he argues that the radical fantasies of financial reset found in contemporary conspiratorialist culture, such as QAnon, the sovereign citizen movement, do not represent a delirious misrepresentation of the logic of finance, but rather exacerbate deleterious potentials already inherent in mainstream financial imagination. So he'll illustrate this argument through the case of the quantum financial system, a concept that began as a fringe millennialist fantasy and has since become a popular interpretation of the coming fintech miracle. Please join me in welcoming Fabian Muniesa.
I would like to thank Marion Fourcade and Brian George and also the program on finance and democracy for this kind invitation. It is truly a privilege for me to be able to share these ideas with you, and it is also a joy to be part of this timely and urgent initiative. I should perhaps start with an apology for such an intimidating title. Finance, technology, and fascism today. This is a hell of a topic, and there are so many angles from which to approach this, especially here in the United States of America, where the question has become momentous, and more particularly here in the Bay Area, where the conversation on techno-fascism has become so topical. The problem is not exclusively North American, though. It is rather global. And the connections between finance, technology, and fascism today are numerous and are being rightly examined by many scholars from multiple perspectives. I would like to contribute to the conversation from a resolutely cultural angle. I mean by this that I look at the echoes of financial and technological imagination, at the worldviews reverberating there, and at the latent hopes and fears that form a political phantasm within them. So I am interested in QAnon, in the political phantasm QAnon represents, and on the part dreams and nightmares of finance and technology play within it. I refer with this expression, QAnon, to the nebulous amalgam that formed in the 2010s as a combination of political insurrectionism and conspiratorial culture in the US, evolving then progressively worldwide in various idiosyncratic manners to then see some of its core components being normalized within a number of situations today. I do not take QAnon as a specific movement, but rather as what I call a syndrome that manifests in many guises. For example, in the form of the sovereign citizens phenomenon, as in the case of the Reichsbürger movement in Germany today, but also in radical cryptocurrency milieus, also sometimes in connection to New Age spiritual doctrines, and then also in contemporary forms of populist rage that strive to find an escape out from what is often called the quote-unquote system. And I am not interested in QAnon alone. Rather, I am intrigued by the structural analogy and ideological connections that there exist between the QAnon syndrome and the disinhibition of fascist propensity in today's high-tech, high-finance mind. So is QAnon a kind of a fascist syndrome? The QAnon syndrome has been already convincingly linked to far-right, authoritarian and reactionary tendencies in a number of studies, but also to ultra-liberal, libertarian or secessionist, and even sometimes socialist tendencies, which corroborates the difficulties of using stable political categories in order to frame the phenomenon. Finance and technology have been also signaled as central to the syndrome, as I claim myself in my book Paranoid Finance. Finance stands indeed as a fundamental leitmotif in QAnon ideation, represented both in core conspiratorialist fears, that is, a vicious plot of globalist bankers, and in central salvific hopes, that is, as a fantastic currency that shall restore individual freedom and true value. And technology is heavily present too, since the key to the radical transformation of the financial order lies within a prodigious technological revolution. Of course, the notion of fascism warrants precaution here. Definitional quandaries about the nature of fascism, together with indeterminacies on the relevance or irrelevance of historical comparisons and analogies, can compromise the traction of the notion. This is well attested by the recent so-called fascism debate in the US, that is, or perhaps was, a controversy on whether or not the word fascism applies to the policies and doctrines prompted by the Trump administration, the first and then the second. To this adds the intrinsic paradoxes fascism itself is made of. So, I employ here the notion of fascism, or rather of fascist propensity, so as to temper the claim, in order to refer to a paradoxical complex that combines two seemingly contradicting political ideals. The first ideal is covered often with reference to authoritarianism, an ideal of hard and implacable government, modeled after military rule or religious doctrine, serving the will of some kind of unrestrained executive power or charismatic leadership, grounded on the need to protect some kind of national, racial, or confessional virtue from internal and external dangers. The second ideal is often associated with liberty, liberalism, neoliberalism, or libertarianism. This is an ideal of personal sovereignty, private property, voluntary contract, unbound energy, and individual strength, grounded on an entitlement to value and a defense of entrepreneurial and financial initiative, presented as a reaction against collective redistribution or socialist policy, with a polity governed through some kind of immediate acclamatory democracy, open to summary justice and to a culture of competition and self-defense. So I think that fascist propensity partakes of both ideals. It is about unleashing the freedom, the will, the destiny, and the value of one sovereign people, most typically a nation, understood in terms of consistent descent, while at the same time ridding it from the cumbersome troubles of plurality, diversity, and commonality, translating ultimately into some kind of a total identification and eventually subjection of that one people to the organ of political authority. So the paradox remains full, but the fact that notions of fascist freedom certainly fit the interpretation of the present moment, as demonstrated, for example, by Alberto Toscano in his book Late Fascism. And I also think of, for the case of present-day Germany, of the excellent work of Caroline Amlinger and Oliver Natzwey in their book Offended Freedom, also Dagmar Herzog in her book The New Fascist Body. So I insist on the fact that the notion of fascism, rather than offering a clear-cut analytical category, works, at least for me, as a vehicle for the understanding of a latent paradox, which may explain also perhaps incidentally that why the notion seems to acquire full analytical clarity only when it's too late. To me, though, there is a sign that links intensely fascist propensity to what I call a radicalization of financial imagination, namely a worldview in which the polity is pictured as a fence against the enemies of value, a protection of value fantasized as a form of entitlement to future revenues, a realm in which, quote-unquote, our value needs to be protected from the perils of sequestration, depreciation, or dilapidation. In the terms of the vernaculars of finance, a protection of the future, a fructification of fundamental value to be protected against the whims of speculative value, that is, a defense of value creation, quote-unquote, against, quote-unquote, value destruction, a terminology that I consider quite provocatively as the seed of the political paranoia that I think I recognize in fascism. I might be slightly paranoid myself, but I think that I do recognize elements of the QAnon playbook in the doctrines of the liberation of value that I read, for example, in the technological eschatology of Peter Thiel, and also more widely in the financial imagination of the likes of Elon Musk or Donald Trump, and even more widely in the mundane culture that portrays these as the heroes of our revaluation. I take this slight induced paranoia of mine, duly controlled, as a fine intellectual instrument for the elucidation of the latent content of our fascist moment. So let me justify this hypothesis with a few ideas, a few details about something called the quantum financial system, which I think offers a fine illustration of the convergence of and towards QAnon syndrome. So quantum financial system, or hashtag QFS, is the name of a magic financial technology. It is a fantasy technology. It does not exist. Or rather, to be more precise, it exists as an element of political phantasm operating at first as a plan within the QAnon syndrome, that morphing more recently into a theme of popular investment culture. Here is an example of a popular QFS diagram shared and discussed online by cryptocurrency influencers and conspiracy theorists, authored by an independent researcher and posted in 2021 on an academic literature platform. I suggest the existence, it suggests the existence of an integrated international plan led by the President of the United States for the end of corruption and the provision of sovereignty by means of the termination of the central banking system and the implementation of a new technology for the transfer of funds in gold-backed digital denomination conveniently secured via VPN, GPS, and low Earth orbit satellite networks, using first, quote-unquote, photonic technology and then quantum networks, superseding cross-border investment payment systems such as SWIFT. The diagram indicates diverse connections between multiple technological and institutional elements. The central contribution of CIPS, cross-border interbank payment system, a clearing and settlement service backed by the People's Bank of China, is highlighted. The role of Starlink, the internet satellite constellation developed by Elon Musk's SpaceX, is also emphasized, and other companies such as IBM or Microsoft are mentioned in their capacity to provide cloud-based quantum computing. So the idea of QFS emerges within the context of Nesara Gesara. These curious pair of acronyms referred at first to a quite remote millennialist conspiratorialist syndrome that formed in the US in the early 2000s, which played a constitutive role in the formation of the QAnon strain. Today, a quick keyword search in one prominent digital social media platform points to ostensibly copious Nesara Gesara content, recent in multiple languages, linking to a variety of topics from personal finance and investment to political revolution, to technological marvel, to spirituality and esotericism, to wellness also, still displaying in most cases blatant elements of millennialist, conspiratorialist discourse. Nesara Gesara is about the imminent coming of a new era of prosperity and freedom, about the fall of an obsolete global order and of the vicious elites that strive to maintain it, and about how to access and understand a revolutionary currency. It's a currency, but also it's a fund, or it's a currency qua fund, or a technology that is money at the same time, that ought to be grounded on complicated principles of energy and information, sometimes also on a novel understanding of cosmic and spiritual order. So Nesara, the acronym, first stood for National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, referred at first to a political proposal put forward in the 1990s by Harvey Barnard, a consultant and engineer, author of a self-published report titled Draining the Swamp. The initiative, which took the form of a proposed bill that was never introduced before the US Congress, consisted in a monetary and fiscal reform proposal aimed at draining the swamp. Indeed, this is a metaphor sometimes used to criticize governmental bureaucracy or lobbyism that was recently popularized by Trump. And this included general prosperity measures such as the restoration of gold as a constitutional currency, the termination of the Federal Reserve System, the elimination of national debt, the abolition of compound interest on loans, and the end of income tax. The proposal was perhaps excessively eccentric, but there was nothing about some kind of a revolutionary technology there, and nothing particularly millennialist or conspiratorialist either, apart from the obvious affinities with the predominant place that the Federal Reserve recurrently occupies in conspiratorialist narratives in the US and elsewhere. A shift occurred in the early 2000s, with Nesara, the acronym now standing for National Economic Security and Reformation Act. This Nesara thing being interpreted from a novel esoteric terms within the context of specific New Age milieus, then acquiring a planetary dimension, with G for global in Gesara. So Dove of Oneness, that's the online persona of someone called Shaini Goodwin, a New Age spirituality consultant, author of this website. She spearheaded this new interpretation, according to which the Nesara bill had been in fact passed in 2000, the year 2000, by the US Congress, albeit secretly. The quiet interpretation of this implied of the implied measures would include also the prospect of the release of some kind of a prosperity fund through a secret computer system that was located in the World Trade Center in New York City. But the process was said to have been jeopardized or delayed due to the purposeful destruction of the computer system within the context of the 9/11 attacks. The narrative initially put forward by Dove of Oneness linked these expected prosperity deliveries to the outcomes of a fraudulent investment scheme called Omega Trust that had affected in particular the adherents of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, a spirituality sect and educational organization established in Washington. And Shaini Goodwin, the Dove of Oneness, had indeed been herself an investor in this scheme and a student in this school. By the mid-2000s, the narrative had evolved into the unveiling of an extensive conspiracy against the full implementation of this radical reform, a reform that was now quite at odds with the original Nesara proposal. Nesara was now, in this new guise, not only about the cancellation of all kinds of sources of economic difficulty, indebtedness, taxation, but also about access to hidden monies, prosperity distribution of vast wealth which has been accumulating for many decades, a political revolution with new elections and also the prevention of illegal election activities, rigging elections, a new legal regime, the return of constitutional law, and the restraint of all judges and attorneys. And also a new global geopolitical order, establishing peace throughout the world. All made possible in part by the implementation of a new, quote-unquote, rainbow currency backed by gold, silver, and platinum. And all that carried out covertly by a virtuous league of white knights with whom Dove of Oneness, she was an insider with a lot of contacts in intelligence milieu, she communicated, counting on the mysterious help of mystical ascended masters, Saint-Germain among others, fighting secretly a league of vicious conspirators, Illuminati and reptilians. The transition within Nesara from gold to something quantum or to some kind of electronic or digital gold and then to the concept of the quantum financial system is difficult to trace. First-hand accounts refer to the quantum financial system emerging around 2018 and being at first the name of an imagined new computer network, a fictional artificial intelligence global banking computer system that was meant to have been developed to serve the Nesara implementation after the previous failure. And early occurrences of the term are explicitly connected to extraterrestrial allies, the Galactic Federation, whom offered the extraordinary engineering skills. Nesara re-emerges in turn as a source of political concern and journalistic attention in the early 2020s in the guise of a specific ramification of the QAnon syndrome. It is nonetheless possible to find earlier in the times of the Dove of Oneness, the early 2000s, and in the spiritual trajectory of Shaini Goodwin, the grounds from this quantum revolution. This is a time of Ramtha's School of Enlightenment and the development of the mythology of New Age esotericism, the doctrines of deep meditation, extrasensory perception, channeling, and the idea of the power to create reality through consciousness. More exactly, through consciousness understood as pure energy. To create reality, and above all, to create value. The formation of the idea of a quantum financial system manifestly inherits from these forms of quantum mysticism in the late 2010s. It is important to note, however, that scientific or pseudoscientific imagination involving the appropriation of concepts from particle physics or quantum mechanics can go in multiple directions. Notions of miraculous marvel can mix sometimes confusedly with notions of horrifying threat, Experiments with particle accelerators, for example, can feed many sorts of millennialist conspiratorialist fears. The fantasy of a quantum breakthrough opening some kind of a satanic gateway may indeed easily match that of redemptory technologies to access superior forms of consciousness, energy, and value. These tensions can also be observed in ordinary technological innovation milieus. In the early 2000s, the imagination of quantum mechanics is marked, for, if not controlled, by the anticipation of the advent of quantum computing and its revolutionary consequences. The race towards quantum supremacy in computer science is recurrently presented as an immense business opportunity, but also as a daunting computer security risk, as advances in quantum computing are meant to make current cryptographic technologies obsolete. Indeed, tendencies towards hyperbole, mystification, and speculation overtly characterize the deep tech field. A critical evolution marks the Nesara syndrome in general and the QFS fantasy in particular, now in the mid-2020s. It is its conflation with crypto culture and its obsession with value, revaluation, and the revaluation of value, and its obsession with technological eschatology. The cultural transformations cryptocurrency comes with carry, at least in part, the sign of the radical political views embraced by early cryptocurrency innovators, as documented, for example, by Finn Brunton in his book, Digital Cash. These views are complex and varied, but they certainly include a recognizable glorification of a secessionist obsession with freedom, but with freedom understood as the unrestrained capacity to transact individually and directly and make money accordingly, protected from the enemies of value. So David Columbia, for example, has formulated convincingly the hypothesis of some kind of a fascist propensity here, there, eminently conspiratorialist at work in these views. This hypothesis becomes even more justified when observed from the angle of the QAnon syndrome. Palpable elements of millennialist conspiratorialist thought can be identified today in popular cryptocurrency investment communities, linking topics of monetary apocalypse to topics of salvific technology. So XRP, a cryptocurrency associated to a specific ledger protocol, the XRP ledger or Ripple protocol, often appears as the quote-unquote chosen one in accounts in which internet influencers develop convoluted interpretations involving complicated symbols and enigmas, sometimes with explicit references to Nesara and to the quantum financial systems and to QAnon. There are traces of this phenomenon in diverse cryptocurrency investment communities all over the world, with recurring references to a great reset and to the demonization of established financial infrastructure such as SWIFT, and also a system, SWIFT, a system which XRP is supposed to be able to replace, acting as a bridge between several currencies. So, great reset. Note that the conspiratorialist, millennialist concept of a great reset is ambiguous and confusing. Sometimes it refers to a negative reading of an initiative put forward by the World Economic Forum in 2020 and is interpreted as a nefarious plan for a globalist control of financial transactions and of value altogether. But some other times, especially within the context of Nesara, it rather refers positively to the great currency reset that will happen with the final implementation of the reform and the activation of the quantum financial system. In this research, I focus on Spain, in part as a way to avoid an over-attention given in these matters to North American culture. So Nico Cabrera and Brodax are two remarked cryptocurrency YouTubers providing content on personal finance, cryptocurrency investment, and financial technology. Their channel offers a wealth of explanations and interpretations on XRP, and related topics. For example, the Great Reset. Here, they ask how is XRP linked to the quantum financial system and to Nesara. Contrary to a plethora of videos found in YouTube, in which the link between XRP and QFS is just affirmed and presented as a key to an imminent revolution, these two consider here the quantum financial system hesitantly as some sort of a hypothesis. So the YouTuber mixes up information about the quantum financial system as conveyed in Nesara narratives and information about the application of quantum computing technologies to banking and finance, referring to actually existing institutional initiatives from the Bank of International Settlement and the World Economic Forum for the anticipation of quantum secure or quantum safe technologies for global financial infrastructures. After a moment in which the threat to cryptocurrency encryption security posed by quantum computing is acknowledged, the explanation shifts back to Nesara. The patchy interpretations offered by Nico and Brodax is focused on the problem of gold. The entire Nesara virtue relies on the restoration of a gold standard. At some point, one of the YouTubers suggests that the ongoing implementation of the plan might explain why central banks are silently accumulating huge quantities of gold. But this YouTuber continues, this requires first a system of storage of actual bullion, and second, a secure method for its geolocalization and tokenization within the shape of some tractable digital gold of sorts. The fact that XRP might constitute the envisaged solution, the chosen one, is considered with tangible interest, also adding to this the fact that XRP can operate as a central bank digital currency of choice. In a more recent series of videos, Brodax, one of the YouTubers here, clarifies the context of such kind of interpretations. The Great Reset is underway. Cryptocurrencies are in fact an instrument in the battle fought by the Alliance. The Alliance is the league of all Chinese and Venetian families with North American patriots led by Donald Trump. A battle against the cabal, an old conspiracy constructed by the Rothschild banking family and crystallizing in the Federal Reserve System and the global network of central banks now virtually defeated. XRP is part of the quantum financial system. This is an infrastructure, in fact a complex system operating as an intelligent neural network, and the main advice is to arbitrage this war between the Alliance and the cabal. Is this anecdotal? Rather not. It is one example among many. There is a relevant social context to this. The culture of personal development and personal finance in Spain in the early mid-2020s is marked by strong surge in popular investment communities and cryptocurrency schemes, or crypto cults, cryptosectas in Spanish, that often display elements of salvific rhetoric and charismatic leadership, positing financial freedom as a response to chronic economic difficulty, particularly among young generations. The notorious case of the investment training organization known as IM Academy was exposed in Spain in the early 2020s. Other comparable initiatives, such as Tu riqueza eres tú, your wealth is you, this is multitudinous events held in several cities across Spain which thrive on the rhetoric of personal development and notions of personal value that ought to be defended, cultivated, and expanded. At some point, the host creates a ritual in which you have to hold a banknote and shout, "El dinero no se quema," you shall not burn money. In her remarkable film Plus 10K, the artist, cinematographer, and researcher Gala Hernandez Lopez captures one of such events and the exhilarating atmosphere of La Riqueza Eres Tú events. The event is filmed in July 2024, is attended by Paul Gasco, this guy, Paul Connor in social media, a young aspiring investment influencer living in Calafell, Tarragona, whose dreams of fulfillment and realization are followed by the cinematographer. Paul is inspired by the New Age doctrine of the law of attraction, also called manifestation, according to which reiterated positive thinking considered as a form of energy, can translate into the effective realization of value. The film conveys a sense of vital generosity, of candid paradox, and of sincere accomplishment through entrepreneurship and hope. But it also signals the troubles inherent in a response to economic stress that can only see escape through individual, independent, financial, and essentially digital value glow. This is Paul today. The development of a market anti-establishment agenda is also part of the political culture found in such popular financial milieus in Spain in the early and mid-2020s. The case of Se acabó la fiesta, the party is over, offers a case in point. This is the name of a far-right political party formed in 2024, which won 3 seats in the same year's European parliamentary elections in Spain following a Snap Online viral campaign. Its founder and leader, Alvise Pérez, is a social media influencer known for his extremist, anti-system rhetoric, populist and confrontational in form, radically liberal in matters of financial freedom, and openly nationalistic and conspiratorialist in topics of migration and international relations. His political views have been compared to that of Javier Milei in Argentina and Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. He is openly sympathetic to a culture of financial freedom and cryptocurrency milieus, to the point of having been himself apparently embroiled into a cryptocurrency fraud case. His views are also in part heavily reminiscent of the tropes and motifs characterizing the QAnon syndrome. A conjecture can then be formed on the affinities linking such particular forms of fascist propensity and on the one hand, and mundane ideas of both financial value and online engagement, here in the particular case of Spain in the mid-2020s. It is about striving to reclaim value, to be free to create it, to become the asset manager of one's own life, and to fight accordingly in the most viral possible way a system that has been put in place to hamper that revolution, and also above all, to come to terms with the quote-unquote parasites that benefit from that system sequestering our value. The conjecture can gain stronger grip if associated to other sources of evidence observed in Spain today. Discrete traces of the QAnon syndrome can be observed, for example, in the cryptocurrency discourse that accompany liberal technophile approaches to secessionist nationalism in Catalonia. So today Catalonia is an autonomous region in the northeastern Spain. The case of ONCE is interesting in this regard, as it involves explicit references to a quantum financial system narratives. ONCE is a modest financial service provider founded 5 years ago by an entrepreneur, James Sené, in collaborations with an independentist association, Unitat per la Independencia, as an instrument for the financial independence of Catalonia. The initiative is reminiscent of early initiatives led in the 2010s by prominent politician and cryptocurrency advocate Carles Puigdemont, aiming at swiftly disconnecting Catalonia from Spain, monetarily and financially, within the context of an attempted snap separatist process. Advertisement materials from ONCE include copious references to the imminent advent of the quantum financial system within the context of a momentous revaluation of gold and the prospect of the coming of the Great Reset. I'm concluding. So present-day conflation between finance, technology, and fascism corresponds to the mainstreaming of the QAnon syndrome. Or, in other words, the fascist propensity that the combination of radicalized financial imagination and disruptive technological disposition comes with becomes apparent today in the expansion of the millennialist conspiratorialist culture exemplified by the idea of the quantum financial system. This general claim, which obviously needs to be very much tempered, I offer it by way of a mere intellectual hypothesis. So the empirical evidence is indeed only incipient, and hasty conclusions are to be avoided. In addition, observed facts can be interpreted in an entirely different manner, and the perspective on fascist propensity that I suggest here can very much well be contested. That said, the illustrative elements provided in this case study demonstrate the heuristic validity of these hypotheses, at least from a cultural angle. In addition, this study matches a series of intuitions that can be formulated, for example, in the light of recent newsworthy developments observed here in the United States of America, for example. There exists a patent analogy between Peter Thiel's vision of the Internet and the QAnon syndrome, and between these and a number of measures prompted within the context of the second Trump administration in 2025. Thiel's narrative can be perfectly read as that of a spiritual war fought and now virtually won by an alliance of virtuous technologists against the guardians of an old cabal, hence coming to terms with the sequestration of value, life, energy, sovereignty, and truth. Trump's initiatives and affirmations can also be read, and are copiously read in that key by followers and supporters, as a variation on the storm anticipated in QAnon discourse. Besides, a number of platform technology companies linked most notable to investors such as Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, among others, seem to be actively serving aspects of a plan that can be arguably interpreted today in terms of QAnon/fascist propensity. Recent illustrations of this tendency abound. Just a few. The implementation of a Department of Government Efficiency under the initial leadership of Elon Musk, aiming at sabotaging public budgets and social services through rapid interventions in governmental information systems, offers a case in point. The exacerbation of political style based on the expedite issuance of executive orders by President Donald Trump can also be interpreted from that perspective. The outstandingly favorable political attitude towards the promotion of cryptocurrencies, including personalized schemes, can be also added to the list. And it is more than promotion. Cryptocurrencies have been explicitly advocated for as a reserve asset for the national treasury within the establishment of a US strategic Bitcoin reserve. All this within the context of curious rumors about gold missing from the bullion depository at Fort Knox. More recently, the radicalization of raid, arrest, detention, and deportation measures within the context of immigration law enforcement has been characterized by practical suspension of civil rights, strong ideological adhesion within enforcement unit, and the use of tactical data analysis technologies. Detention and deportation measures, in turn, have relied on expedite procedures with experimental recourse to the subcontracting of secretive prison services in separate jurisdiction, namely in El Salvador. As for the curbing of so-called global woke elites, which perhaps is a typical sign of a fascist propensity, Trump's organized attacks on prominent universities provide also an interesting instance of the general problem, the storm against the cabal. Does all this mean that QAnon has won? Is the quantum financial system the fascist phantasm of our time? I suggest that the present situation demands attention to these analogies, which I tend indeed to take as valid evidence of fascist propensity and as a demonstration of the part played by finance and technology in this syndrome. The approach favored in this study is culturalist, though, and I focus solely on traits of mundane stereotypy, collective imagination, and vernacular thought, neither on social structures, nor on economic processes, nor on political institutions as such. This limit is obviously a matter of both capacity and inclination, and is emphatically not exclusionary. I nonetheless think it can contribute, in combination with other perspectives, to the elucidation of the troubling meanings of finance in times for radicalization. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Fabian, for that wonderful talk. So now we'll pivot to Q&A. just gently remind folks that questions are indeed questions rather than comments. So catch my eye and I'll pass the microphone to you and then take it back.
Thanks so much for that talk. I wanted to ask you actually about sort of the component of fascism that you didn't touch on, but it actually ended up coming up a bit towards the end of your talk, which is the sort of civic mass mobilization sort of ritual element of fascism. Because what I was struck by is the case of Spain, particularly tu riqueza eres tú, that those kind of events seems like there's an element of mass mobilization that's perhaps missing, in fact, from the US case. Besides the sort of blogosphere that you're doing this close reading of, I'm wondering if you saw any sort of similar examples in the US case that would kind of reveal, this civic basis of the story, which did come really to the forefront in the Spanish case, I think.
Oh, thanks a lot. I don't have it's a very good question. I don't have an answer. I mean, it's true that the access to the North American case is mostly here a matter of access to, thought by thought leaders, in a sense, without a proper ethnography. And I didn't carry an ethnography in Spain either. But it's true that I thought about approaching this phenomenon in Spain from the perspective of popular culture, in a sense. And the work of this researcher, Gala Hernandez Lopez, was very inspirational because that's the way she tackles that. She goes to the place and she mingles with these people. And these La Riqueza Eres Tú events are really popular and they are really moving, in a sense. You see people crying and shouting. There is I think that the comparison would be with evangelical meetings or something like that. There is something deeply religious about that. And there is not something explicitly self-reference to fascism in any way. It's more about freedom. About freedom, but about the protection from the enemies of freedom. And these fantasized enemies is where the crystallization towards forms of more far-right political initiatives can go.
Hi, thank you. This is so fascinating, and brings me back to so many conversations I've had with my parents in the kind of new age space that they're in. And so one question I have is what we lose by maybe starting with QAnon versus maybe more kind of historical genealogies, like a broader history of financial self-help and like of pseudoscience. And part of what that may reveal is less that this affinity with fascism may actually be much more contingent and contemporary, and rather that this may be a style of sort of what Naomi Klein's diagonalism, the kind of a kind of a broad paranoia and sort of anti-elitism that is actually quite swayable in many directions, but cuts across left and right, and that fascists have been more able to turn into participatory programs. But to what extent is this necessarily fascist versus something that's actually maybe quite diagonal?
No, thank you very much. That's very important, and I think that this kind of confluence can be examined through many kind of angles and historical genealogies and so on. The thing is that with QAnon is in part a movement that is localized. It's very North American, but it's also a global syndrome. I mean, QAnon is super present in Spain, in France, in the UK, in Japan, in Australia, everywhere. And it's not the same QAnon as here. It's just, that's what I use the notion of a syndrome. It's not the real QAnon. There is no Pizzagate. There is no, sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But in all, there is this kind of, obsession with this kind of financial thing. And that's why I think it's perhaps a shortcut, but in a sense, the mainstreaming of QAnon, this is what I recognize as a sociological phenomenon, that QAnon is not a fringe thing anymore. It's everywhere. And so this is unfolding before our eyes. So there are many angles, many paths, many trajectories But the QAnon one is so evident, is so there, is so that's maybe also the evidence of my own paranoia, that I see QAnon everywhere, and that's perhaps too much. But I think that there is a good lead here.
The question, in a sense, is whether they are effective as electoral strategies. And as electoral strategies, those ideas of conspiracy and the way they affect individuals when they decide to vote, is that a way of mobilizing vote which is effective? And if it is, in a sense, the way to fascism is because you elicit votes based on anger, based on you reject ideas, you reject those ideas of conspiracy that you expose. Then you are able to be elected without platform. And then once you are elected, you have free hand to go where you want. Yeah. That, in a sense, is what Trump is doing. And that's what fascism, this is where source of this, those electoral strategies based on conspiracy theories are ways to gain elections without commitment and then to have free hand to go where you want.
True. I think that the example in Spain of this small alt-right party, Se acabó la fiesta, the party is over, is very interesting because it's crypto troll. This guy is a scammer, but he has a lot of traction in this kind of population because so there is no political platform. It's more about trolling the system. The guy won 3 seats in the European Parliament. He doesn't go there. The seats are vacant. It's really anti-system. They don't grab power. They just loathe the system. That's the thing. So there is an angle which is the electoral system. You know, the conquest of the political space through the ability of paranoid style in North American politics. But there is also a parallel track, which is we are secessionist movement where we separate from this system. And I think that's also another channel. So there are several channels, and the same with also the channels of spiritual communities, which might not reach power from the perspective of political institutions, but that can have this kind of huge secessionist attraction, like the sovereign citizen movement. In Germany, the Reichsbürger movement is mingling sometimes with the AfD, but some other times it's a threat on its own, without access to parliamentary politics, in a sense.
Thank you, Fabian. That was great. So, you know, you said it's an unfair question because you said explicitly that you were focusing on the cultural aspects of this, the semiotic aspect. But of course, I can't help but ask the question because crypto is really no small matter. It's a huge, it's a huge industry. It is backed by venture capital, increasingly institutional capital. So there's a real material infrastructure behind this. And in particular, all of these influencers that you observe, they're not simply sui generis. They're not simply sort of rising to the top and gaining followers because of their appeal. They're actually paid by the crypto companies. I mean, there's a lot of money behind this, and in particular behind the social media infrastructure that actually supports this. So I just want you to. It's a comment, I guess.
No. I endorse a comment. What you're meaning is that someone should do a sociology of that. I'm a lousy sociologist. I just look around and have ideas, but it's true. It's true that something should be done from the sociological angle to look at the business model of these guys, to do some quantitative analysis of the stereotypy, the spread of this, to download these kind of things and code them. That's should be done. I'm not good at that. I'm just not good. I'm not good at doing that. But that's something that needs to be done. And also the role of the fact that these platforms are feeding these kids with contracts, with apps. There is an app called Quant Fury. It's the quantum financial system, literally. So what is the business model? Who is behind? Why is this company incorporated in Bahamas? What is the connection with El Salvador? Those are sociological and political questions that need to be tackled, yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk, Fabian. I have two questions, and so I'll start with one which maybe is also a little bit unfair. But you said at the start that you saw this as a structural analogy between the QAnon, QFS type, and the techno-fascism, the elites. I just want to ask, what is structural about this analogy? How do you see these two things as having some sort of structural linkage? Is it about the discourse or the logic or the paranoia about value having a structural element? Or could it be, to point more to maybe material circumstances, the fact that both the QAnon influencers are often talking about their kind of literal structural burdens on the ability to create value because of government taxation and sovereign citizen movement, and then the same way that the techno elites talk about and the techno fascists talk about the structural constraints that the government places upon their ability to create value. And so is that the structural? What's the structural?
Good. It's not an unfair question. It's not a trap question. I think it's a good question. I think that I want to become a structuralist here. I think it is structural in a very Levi-Strauss kind of way. Maybe it's not, maybe it's just delusional, but in that case I would say rather structuring analogy. The analogy is structuring the conversation. I mean, there is an analogy, and the analogy might come out of the blue, but then it's performative, or on the contrary, the analogy is revealing a semiotic connection between the QAnon phantasms and the mind of Peter Thiel. I'm all for the second option, but it requires more empirical evidence, I guess.
Am I allowed a second question? Thank you. Thank you for that response. My second question is, I'm curious how applicable you think terms such as Nick Land's hyperstition or Merton's self-fulfilling prophecy might be here, in which we have a lot of people. I'll just say from some of my own research on this, right? We've seen like crypto influencers or crypto companies are giving money to politicians across the board to try to get this type of mindset into office, right? They'll say, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, just as long as you create provisions that are favorable to crypto companies, right? And so you're electing people who are come in with the belief that, that we have to have a reevaluation of value. We need to, upend the current financial system. And so the conspiracy becomes real, right? Yeah. This is what allows for that translation. Do you think there's an element of self-fulfilling prophecy here?
Probably, but then you want to interpret this in kind of a path dependence way of people getting syndromes getting reinforced. I want to be more structuralist. I think that the kernel of this is this toxic phantasm of real value to be protected against the enemies of value. And this is the same kernel that you find in Blood Libel, kind of old times, National Socialist anti-Semitism. This is the kind of syndrome that Moshe Postone identified in Nazi Germany. This is the one that Michel Fer is also locating in the National Rally in France in his work on the vocabulary of parasites versus producers. So there is something that, irrespective of the performative paths and processes and so on, it's a syndrome in a sense. It's something that has to do with the radicalization of the concepts of liberal democracy or value and so on. So the problem is this escalation, this exacerbation of a literal understanding of these concepts, starting with the very concept of value, that are not toxic per se, are toxic if you take them seriously, in a sense. That's also a symptom of that is the obsession with gold. Gold appears as an obsession when you are so preoccupied by fundamental value. Instead of just taking it easy, you say, well, what is fundamental value? How do I prepare for the disappearance of value? What if the enemies of value really come and get me? What do I get? What I hold? Gold. So, and this is an old classic also of the presence of something, I don't know if structural but something that is less path dependent and more cultural in a sense, in a wider sense, I would say.
This is fascinating, and it's fascinating to hear about the vernacular culture related to finance on the alt-right. But I'm wondering whether there isn't also lurking in what you say a rather interesting and novel political analysis of class divisions within capital itself behind what you say. I mean, normally one thinks of fascism, as Postone, for example, analyzed it, as mobilizing paranoia in the form of anti-Semitism in the interest of the financial class as a whole, which purges its Jewish elements, but benefits, Hallenmarstracht and so on and so forth in Germany under the Nazis. That fascism serves the interests, the class interests of finance and financial accumulation. You seem to be suggesting that there may be, as symptomatized by this, a division within the financial class between the technological sector, which supports these views and is seeking popular support, for example, against the banking sector. In other words, that there seems to be a class division within capitalism that's reflected in the popular discourse that you're talking about, and that is part of a political campaign by a techno-fascist element within capital to take over finance from the banking system. Are you looking toward an alternative analysis of what fascism has become based on a division within the class that fascism has typically or historically served?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. I don't have a clear answer. I think that the question is clear. What I believe is that there is a recurring reflex in the analysis of finance, a political reflex, which is to consider that there are two kinds of finances. One is good and the other one is bad. So there are good bankers that invest in real economy and create value for the future. And there are bad bankers that fantasize with, transhumanist speculations and so on. And to me, this narrative is a vernacular narrative. It's also, bankers have this narrative. I mean, asset managers, BlackRock wants to protect you from the techno-fascists at some point. So I prefer to take a step aside and to consider that the toxicity is in the financial imagination proper, that even the idea that there is true value and false value, that you have to protect fundamental value against the whims of speculative value, this is to me vernacular in a sense. And I think it's useful. It's useful because otherwise you may fall in a trap. The trap is to criticize finance with the concepts invented by finance. For example, the concept of true value creation or future returns and so on. And well, you can escape that trap, but I prefer to be, to be cautious with this distinction between there are two kinds of finance, one is bad and one is good. Or to say that it's all bad, in a sense.
With regard, so you've concentrated on finance in terms of trading currency, trading financial instruments, and underlying that is some notion of ownership and of what can be owned, what cannot be owned, by whom and by what, and we're 145 years away from declaring that humans can't be owned in this country. How do the dimensions of ownership, the possible dimensions of ownership, especially with such a dirty history, play into this worldwide as well?
No, I think that's a very important question. To me, I mean, this is more apparent in the sovereign citizen movement. There is a sanctification of property. There is an obsession with slavery. I mean, the idea is that we need to escape enslavement, that we inherit in an occulted fashion from the law of slavery, and then we need to restore the original constitution. We need to restore, I mean, 1776 is a magical number in conspiracy theory because it's about the reconstruction of natural law also, a law that is a contractual law, common law, the common law courts. In Europe it's more natural law, and the idea is that you are what you own, and you own yourself, you own your kids, you own your value, your car, and that's the thing that makes you an investor of oneself, of yourself. There is a particular strain which is not QAnon. It's a sovereign citizen movement. It's called the OPPT, One People's Public Trust. It was invented here in the US, but it's popular in Europe and elsewhere, in Latin America. And one of the doctrines there is that value doesn't come from gold. It comes from you. You are value. You are the eternal currency. You are a creator's asset value center. You are yourself a fund in a sense, and you have to protect this yield through creating barriers against the enemies of value. So this kind of sanctification of the property of value and the entitlement of value, I think, is fundamental in order to understand this. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the talk, Fabian. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the temporal frames of value that this particular variety of fascist uses, or fascist imaginary employs. I'm thinking about both your framing on millennial thinking. Like, I saw one of the videos had a title that was like, El gran reset económico ya está aquí, like the big economic reset is already here, which kind of had an echo of Cristo ya viene. Is how that contrasted with the kind of fascist nostalgia, the usual obsession with bloodlines or ancient bloodlines and this kind of thing. It seems like it's pulling in two different directions, maybe, or has this version completely abandoned, similar to how it's sort of abandoned the gold standard, it's also abandoned that obsession with the past?
Bloodlines, kings and queens are super important here. I mean, when you look at the QAnon conspiracy theory, the European versions are very much into this kind of genealogies, or the Rothschild families, the Venetian, the Chinese elder family of the royal dragon, Taiwanese. It's about families and so on. So it's about descent. There is a it's not immediately racial, but it's sexual. It's about bloodlines and creating nations, creating this kind of consistent descent, in a sense. And so this is how people see themselves. They don't look at one particular bloodline, but the connection with sexy forms of racism, in where we inherit from a culture, we are from this country, we deserve respect, we are entitled to a value because we are a people, and we need to protect ourselves from this system that that robs our value and gives it away to these other people. That's super important. So yes, it's not a nostalgia, but it's an emphasis on history. These people become historians. They look into the papal decrees and the Magna Carta and this sort of thing. So there is an emphasis on the knowledge of where all these come from, and how the war has been going on for centuries between the cabal and the alliance. So it's true that the time is complex. There is the future, salvific future of return. There is the present, like it's not going to happen. It already happened. You don't know, but it's already occurring. and the past. So it's a very elastic kind of time. Yes, it's true. It's a fractal time, perhaps.
So I'm wondering if you can connect perhaps your analysis to the particularities of finance today. If you think about the work of Camporoso, Satanasiu, and the fact that everything has become speculative, that in some way social media and the internet are sort of accelerating speculation as a social process, that you have, the phenomena of, meme stocks, people ganging together to sort of reclaim value, the prediction markets and so on, all of these innovations really within the financial system that at the same time sort of weaken, make value so much more volatile and, I suppose in the mind of everybody, right? But those gives people the idea that they can act and band together to reclaim it, but also, creates this, this inherent volatility in the system that makes them subject to this, to these ideas.
Thank you very much. I think that I'm not comfortable with the idea that finance is speculation. I think that finance, how should I put it? We tend to equate finance with volatility, whimsical prices, the stock exchange, speculation, no value, value destruction, fictions. And then we use kind of financial concepts in order to cement another alternative, which is finance as investment, value creation, the future, not the present. Capital. Capital is not about, going around selling and buying things. It's about protecting a rent. And to me, finance is both. And these people won't talk of themselves as speculators. They talk about investment. I'm an asset manager, gestor de cartera. I'm an asset manager. This kid, Paul Gasco, is an asset manager. He's not a speculator. He creates value. It's value creation. He wants to take his aunt out of poverty. So it's about financial education. It's not about, volatility. On the contrary, it's about hooking to something stable, creating stability, creating a future. And I think that both are finance. It's just not true that there are, financial valuation is about, playing around with the contradiction that there are two forms of value. One is a speculative, it's the market, and the other is fundamental value. It's very bizarre, but in finance, people use the notion of things being overvalued and undervalued. It sounds okay, but it means that there are two values. One is true, and the other that is not true. And you hope for a convergence between the market price and the fundamental value. But there are two values. And the tension in valuation is to, playing with this tension between the real value of an asset and the value, the speculative value in the market. And this tension is part of the quote unquote disease. It's part of the toxicity of financial imagination, I would say. So I think that accounts of finance that overemphasize the part played of fictionality and the whims of the market and speculative, beauty contests and so on, miss the fact that the evil twin, the gentle twin, is also part of financial imagination. Value creation, investment, securing the yield and so on, producing wealth. So I think that, it's good to put both on an equal level, I would say.
Thank you all so much. This is a really wonderful conversation. So please join me in giving Fabian a round of applause.
Thank you.